Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Thornburg. I had a 2-year-old in my office today for a well child check, and I always love these visits because that's the only age where I can plot a child on the World Health Organizational growth curve and the CDC growth curve. The WHO growth curve is from birth until 2 years old. The CDC growth curve is from 2 to 18 years old. And why do we use a WHO curve and a CDC curve? Well, they represent different things. The WHO curve was developed using children from a diverse setting of populations. They include children from the United States, Brazil, Norway, Ghana, and India. And because we're using all these different populations, we have determined that that is a representation of optimal growth for that birth until 2-year-old age group. And so when I look at those curves from the birth until 2, I can tell a parent if their child is being overnourished or undernourished against age equivalent peers. Now let's jump over to the CDC growth curve. Again, this starts at 2 years old. They're the US growth curves, and they represent not optimal growth like the WHO curves. What they represent is a comparison against kids in the United States from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. It doesn't represent optimal growth again. It just represents how are they growing against that other cohort of kids over that 40-year span. And as we know, children were becoming more and more obese as we went from the 60s until the 90s. And they're even heavier now compared to the 90s. But what that does when we shift curves from the WHO onto the CDC is it normalizes kids who are overweight. Because if we're comparing them not against optimal growth, but against other overweight kids, well, then your kid looks a little bit normal. So on the 2-year-old I had in the office today, their weight was 25.7 pounds. And on the WHO curve, that put them at the 37th percentile. Then on the US curve or the CDC curve, they were in the 24th percentile. So there was a decrease of 13 percentage points just by jumping curves. So you can see, and I showed the parents how jumping the curves, changing our definitions, not informing parents about the change in curves, and now we see a weight percentile decrease of a significant amount. That just normalizes the obesity epidemic. As our kids today become heavier, the CDC, in order to continue that normalization path and avoid dealing with metabolic disease in this country, they're going to have to take a new cohort, or they're going to have to limit their cohort towards those kids that are more from the 80s and 90s and drop those from the 60s and 70s in order to normalize those kids a little bit more. You can see that there's a lot of bias written into the definitions that we use as physicians. These definitions aren't always explained to the parents. Here is a very dramatic setting where you can see that nutrition matters, how we define nutrition matters, and all of this goes to either support wellness or to promote disease. And I argue that the CDC growth curves are promoting disease by not addressing the metabolic issues that this country is facing. Thanks a lot for watching.